A man vanishes without a trace, then another and another. At first, the villagers believe it's the work of wild animals, but then the disappearances become too frequent, too calculated. Entire families are swallowed by the night, leaving behind nothing but shattered carts and blood-stained dirt. No bodies, no answers, just fear. For years, the locals whisper about something lurking in the cliffs of Benane Head, a hidden horror, something not quite human. But the truth is far worse than they could ever imagine. Deep within the Scottish coastline, beneath the roaring waves, lies a cave, and within that cave, a family of monsters was born. Before the legend, before the horror, there was just a man who refused to live by the rules of others. Alexander Sawney Bean was born in East Lothian, the son of a simple laborer. His father spent his days digging ditches and mending hedges, breaking his back for a few pennies, only to return home exhausted, hands raw, body aching. From the moment he could walk, he was put to work. His father believed that a man's worth was measured by how much he could endure. That pain built character. That suffering made you strong. Sawney learned early that hunger was expected, that exhaustion was normal, that to complain was to invite the back of a hand. His father didn't raise sons, he raised workers. But Sawney wasn't like the other men in East Lothian. He knew it from a young age. He saw them, bent over in the fields, hands thick with calluses, faces hollowed by years of mindless labor. They worked until their bodies betrayed them, until their backs broke and their fingers curled inward, stiff and useless. And for what? A handful of coins? A meal? The chance to die exhausted and forgotten? He didn't take orders easily. He didn't understand why men spent their lives breaking their backs, only to die in the same filth they were born into. He saw no honor in it, no pride, only chains. The other boys in the village grew up knowing their place. They were taught to obey, to work, to accept their lot in life. But Sawney questioned everything. He watched his father's hands grow rough and his body grow weak. He watched other men die on their feet, broken before they reached 40. And he knew this was not the life he wanted. He tried for a time to fit in, to be what was expected. But there was something in him that would not bend, a hunger he could not explain. Work was not enough. Survival was not enough. He wanted more than his father had, more than any of these men would ever have. He refused to be another nameless body in the dirt. And so, he walked away. He left behind the fields, the tools, the endless cycle of labor. He abandoned the father who had given him nothing but a name. And for the first time, Sawney felt free. But freedom comes with a price. He had no home, no land, no coin. The world belonged to those who took it, and Sawney was ready to take. It started small. A loaf of bread, a few coins lifted from a careless hand. It was easy. Easier than breaking his back in the fields, easier than waiting for scraps. And each time the fear faded, the guilt disappeared, and in its place came something else, something that felt like power. Stealing wasn't just about survival, it was proof. Proof that the rules didn't apply to him, that the world didn't belong to those who worked hardest. It belonged to those who dared to take. By the time he was a man, he no longer felt anything when he stole. No hesitation, no regret. He walked through the village, past the men who had spent their lives working for every meal, and he pitied them. They would never know what it felt like to be free. But even then, it wasn't enough. Theft could only take him so far. He needed more. He needed to become more. The first time Sawney hurt a man, it wasn't planned. It was a simple job. Cut a purse, take what he could, vanish into the crowd. But the man caught him, grabbed him by the wrist, called for help. In that moment, something inside Sawney snapped. He did not beg. He did not run. He grabbed a rock and swung. The man crumpled, blood spilled onto the dirt, and for the first time in his life, Sawney felt no fear, only exhilaration. He had always thought of himself as different. Now he knew why. Because he was willing to do what others were too weak to do. Because while the rest of the world bowed and obeyed, he had just proven a simple truth: that power belonged to those who took it. And so he took. But hunger grows, just like ambition. And before long, Sawney wanted to thrive, to rule, to control. And to do that, he needed something more than just quick hands and a sharp mind. He needed something darker, something stronger. And then he met her. Sawney didn't meet Agnes in the woods or along the cliffs. He met her in the middle of a crime. It was a cold night, and he was following a merchant through a narrow path outside town. The man was alone, weighed down with coin, easy prey. Sawney had done this before. Wait for the right moment, strike, take what's needed. Simple. But just as he stepped forward, a blade was already at the merchant's throat. A woman stood behind him. Her grip was steady, her face calm. Sawney watched as she whispered something in the man's ear, and then, with no hesitation, she cut. The merchant barely had time to choke before he hit the ground. Agnes wiped the blood from her hands, turned to Sawney, and smiled. "You were too slow," she said. That was the first time he saw her. Black Agnes Douglas, a woman who killed without hesitation, who didn't flinch at the sight of a man's last breath. There was no fear in her eyes, no doubt, just certainty. Who was exactly that Black Agnes Douglas? Before they feared her, before they whispered her name as a curse, Agnes Douglas was just a girl born into a family that wished she had never existed. She was the second daughter of a man who wanted only sons. In her father's eyes, she was a burden, a mouth to feed with no worth to offer. And in her mother's eyes, she was a failure, a child who should have been quiet, obedient, humble. But Agnes was never any of those things. She questioned too much. She spoke too boldly. She refused to lower her eyes when men addressed her. She did not weep when beaten. She did not flinch when threatened. There was something in her that would not break, and that made them afraid. In the village, they said she had a dark heart, that misfortune followed her like a shadow. When her older brother fell from the cliffs and broke his neck, they whispered that she had pushed him. When the livestock sickened, when crops failed, when her mother miscarried, they called her cursed. They never said it to her face, but she saw it in their eyes. And then there was the night of the fire. Her father had drunk too much. Again. His temper burned hotter than the hearth, and Agnes had learned long ago that when he reached for the belt, it was best not to run. But that night, she didn't take it. She didn't kneel. She didn't beg. She picked up a poker from the flames and pressed the burning iron against his throat. His screams brought the village running. When they tore her away, he was still alive, but his voice never came back. And that was enough. That was the moment they decided she was a demon. They dragged her into the street, threw stones, spat on her. There was no trial, no judgment, no mercy. Only her mother standing among them, watching as they cast her out, saying nothing. She was 16. She never saw them again. She never wanted to. Most would not have survived alone. A girl, homeless, hunted, with no food, no shelter. But Agnes did, because while she had nothing, she had no fear. And in the streets, fear was weakness. It made you prey, and she would never be prey again. She learned to fight before she learned to steal. She learned that a knife was more useful than a kind word, that a full belly was worth a broken nose, that people only took from you what you allowed them to take. And so, she took first. The first man she killed was not for survival. It was for revenge. A drunkard who thought a starving girl would be easy to break. She slit his throat in an alleyway and watched him drown in his own blood. No hesitation, no guilt, just a quiet understanding that she had done what was necessary, that this world had no rules, only predators and prey. She chose her side, and when she met Sawney Bean, she saw a man who understood that too. The night they met, she was the one who killed first, and Sawney didn't stop her. He didn't flinch. He didn't preach morality like so many others. He simply watched, studied, and when she turned to him and asked if he had a problem with it, he shook his head. He didn't run. He didn't turn her in. He followed her. Sawney learned from her. Agnes had no hesitation, no fear of blood, no doubt. She did not kill because she had to. She killed because she wanted to, because it was her choice. Sawney listened, watched. They weren't partners. They weren't lovers. They were something worse. Together they vanished from the towns into the wild, to a place where no one could reach them, where they could take as much as they wanted, where they could make their own rules. And in the shadows of Benane Head, they found their home. By the time Sawney and Agnes left the roads behind, they had stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were. They had killed before. They had stolen. They had hunted men as easily as animals. But living in the shadows of towns, lurking on the edges of civilization, was no longer enough. There were too many eyes, too many rules, too many people who would call them monsters. If the world had no place for them, then they would carve one out themselves. They traveled further, deeper into the wilderness, moving north through the hills and along the coast. The land was harsh, barren. No farms, no inns, no watchful neighbors. It was what they needed. Emptiness. A place forgotten by the world. A place where no one would ever come looking. And then, they found it. It was nothing more than a black mouth in the cliffs, half drowned by the tide. A cave, deep and winding, hidden beneath the roar of the sea. Most would have walked past it. Most would have seen nothing but rock and water. But Sawney and Agnes saw something else. A home. It was perfect. The entrance flooded at high tide, concealing them from sight. The tunnels stretched deep into the cliffs, forming a maze of stone and darkness. No one would find them here. No one would hear the screams. This was where it would begin. The cave was perfect. It was as if the land itself had carved out a place for them, hidden beneath the cliffs, swallowed by the sea each day, and revealed only when the tide receded. To the outside world, it was nothing, a black hole in the rock, too deep, too dangerous, a place only fools would dare enter. But to Sawney and Agnes, it was exactly what they needed. It stretched deep into the earth, further than any sane man would dare go. Nearly 200 yards of twisting tunnels, some so narrow they had to crawl, others opening into vast chambers where the air hung thick with the scent of salt and damp stone. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. The crashing waves faded, the wind disappeared, only silence remained. It was cold, dark, endless, but that didn't matter. They didn't need comfort. They needed invisibility. They needed a place where no one would ever come looking, and they had found it. By day, the entrance vanished beneath the tide, sealing them inside. No tracks, no trails, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. It was as if they had ceased to exist. And at night, the water pulled back, opening the path once more, letting them step out, unseen, into a world that never saw them coming. This was no longer just a shelter, no longer just a hiding place. It was something more. It was home. At first, it was just the two of them, Sawney and Agnes, hidden beneath the cliffs, living off the land, surviving like animals. But survival was never enough. They had left civilization behind, and now they would build something of their own. The first child was born in the dark. No midwives, no prayers, just blood and silence. A child born not into the world of men, but into the shadows. A child who would never know anything beyond the cold stone of the cave, the whisper of the tide, and the hunger that lived in their bones. And then there was another, and another, and another. By the time the first generation was grown, there were nearly 20 of them, and they did not stop. Year after year, child after child, the Bean clan expanded. By the second generation, they numbered over 40. By the third, nearly 50. A bloodline that never left the shadows. A people who had never known the sun. The cave was all they knew. They had never walked a village street, never seen a field of wheat, never heard the ringing of a church bell. They were born in the dark, raised in the dark, lived in the dark. There was no fire. Fire was dangerous. Fire meant smoke, and smoke could be seen. They ate in the cold, drank from the tide pools that formed in the lower chambers. Their eyes adjusted to the blackness, their bodies to the damp. They slept in piles of fur and stolen cloth, huddled together like beasts. They whispered, never spoke. They moved like shadows, never ran. Their world was a world of silence and stone, where sound was an enemy, and the only light came from the moonlit entrance when the tide receded. The younger ones learned quickly. Obedience was survival. The rules were simple. Never leave without permission. Never make noise near the entrance. And most of all, never let the outsiders see you. They should have been discovered. 50 bodies cannot live in a cave forever without being noticed. But they were careful. They had rules. Rules that were followed without question. 1. Never hunt close. The farther the prey, the safer the clan. 2. Never take more than needed. A missing family is noticed. A missing man is forgotten. 3. Never leave remains near the cave. The sea takes everything. Let it. 4. If you are seen, you do not return. The clan survives. The individual does not. These were not just rules. They were law. And the clan obeyed without hesitation. Because to disobey was to bring death to them all. At first, they hunted in the wild. Rabbits, fish, seabirds. They stole from farms in the dead of night, taking chickens, potatoes, whatever they could carry. But there were too many mouths, and hunger was a constant companion. Stealing was dangerous. Livestock was counted. Missing food raised questions. But men disappeared all the time. Men wandered too far from the road. Men got lost. Men were never found. And so the clan made a decision, one that would change everything. They would stop hunting animals. They would stop stealing grain. They would feed on something no one would miss. They would feed on the travelers. These travelers are outsiders. They were not like them. They were not of the clan. They did not belong. They were animals, prey, and prey existed to be taken. The children learned this before they could even speak. Their first solid food was the flesh of men. Their first lesson was silence. Their first game was hiding. And when they were old enough, they were taught to hunt, to wait in the darkness, to move unseen, to drag the bodies back to the cave before the tide swallowed the evidence. And always, there was the same lesson whispered into their ears before they slept. The world beyond the cave was not theirs. The people outside were not like them. The world would never accept them. The world would kill them if it found them. So they stayed hidden, and they grew, and they waited. It began slowly. A man here, a woman there, a lone traveler who strayed too far from the safety of the villages. At first, they only took the desperate, the lost, the forgotten, the ones no one would miss. But as the clan grew, so did their hunger. And soon, they stopped waiting for victims to come to them. They took to the roads. The Bean clan learned to hunt like wolves. They moved in silence, hidden by the cliffs, watching from the darkness. They knew the roads, knew which paths were busiest, which travelers were most vulnerable. A merchant riding alone, a couple returning from the market, a family too foolish to travel without guards. They struck like shadows, quick, merciless. They gave no warning, no chance to scream. A blade to the throat, a club to the skull. By the time the bodies hit the ground, they were already being dragged into the night. By morning, there was no trace, no blood, no bodies, just the wind howling through the empty roads. They were not reckless. They were careful, precise. Every kill was calculated, every disappearance designed to look like an accident. A smashed cart near a ravine, a torn cloak caught on jagged rocks, a boot floating in the tide. Clues left behind, but never answers. The land itself took the blame. It was the cliffs, they said, the sea, the bandits, anything but the truth. And so the killings continued, and no one suspected a family was lurking beneath their feet, watching, waiting, feeding. It was not just killing. It was not just feeding. It was a ritual. The bodies were brought back to the cave, stripped of their clothing, their bones picked clean. The meat was divided, the freshest for the strongest, the scraps for the young. The bones were used for tools, the hair woven into rope. Nothing was wasted. It was survival. It was necessity. It was the way of the clan. To them there was no shame, no horror. The children did not cry. The mothers did not flinch. They ate in silence, the sound of tearing flesh echoing through the tunnels, the taste of iron thick on their tongues. And when the last scraps were gone, they went back to the roads. The disappearances did not go unnoticed. Rumors spread through the villages. Travelers spoke of strange shapes moving along the cliffs, of cries heard in the distance, of camps found abandoned with no sign of struggle. Some claimed it was spirits, angry ghosts haunting the coastline. Others said it was the work of monsters, creatures that had never been meant to exist. But no one believed it was men. No one imagined it was a family. No one thought to look beneath the rocks, beneath the tide, where the true horror was waiting. For years, the Bean clan ruled the roads. They grew bold, they grew ruthless, and they grew hungrier. But like all monsters, their reign would not last forever. For years, the roads belonged to the Bean clan. They killed without fear, fed without consequence. But arrogance is a dangerous thing, and in the end, it was their hunger that betrayed them. The attack should have been like any other. A man and a woman returning from the fair, their cart heavy with goods, their minds lost in laughter. Easy prey. The clan struck as they always had, fast, silent, overwhelming. But this time they made a mistake. They went for the woman first. Her husband fought, harder than they expected. He drove his horse into them, lashed out with his sword, cutting deep into the first body that lunged for him. He did not run. He did not beg. He stood his ground. And before the Beans could finish the job, other riders appeared on the horizon. A patrol, armed men who had been traveling behind the couple, close enough to hear the screams, close enough to see the horror unfolding before them. The clan scattered, fled into the night, but for the first time they had left something behind, a body, a sign, a witness, and now the hunt was coming for them. The man rode straight to King James VI himself. He told of the attack, of the creatures that had come for him in the dark, of their faces, pale, wild, twisted by the light of the moon. He spoke of their inhuman strength, their madness, their hunger, and the king listened. The disappearances had gone on for too long. The roads had grown too dangerous. The whispers of the cliffs could no longer be ignored, and so King James gathered an army, 400 men, horses, hounds, torches that burned against the night sky like falling stars. They scoured the land, every road, every village, every forest path, but they found nothing, No signs, no tracks. The monsters had vanished, but the king knew they were still there, still watching, still waiting. And so he looked where no one had ever dared to look before, the cliffs. For days, the king's men searched. They scoured the forests, the villages, the cliffs. They found nothing. It was as if the killers had never existed. But then, the hounds caught a scent. It led them to the shoreline where the tide had begun to pull back, revealing jagged rock and shifting sand. And there, at the base of the cliffs, hidden beneath the shadow of the stone, they saw it. A hole, narrow, unassuming. A place no man would enter willingly. The soldiers hesitated. The air that seeped from the opening was wrong, thick, rotten. It clung to the throat, sour with decay. Even the hounds whimpered, tails tucked between their legs, teeth bared at the darkness ahead. Something was inside, but orders were orders, and so torches were lit, blades were drawn, and one by one, they stepped into the abyss. The deeper they went, the worse it became. The walls were slick, damp with years of filth. The floor crunched beneath their boots, something brittle, something too fragile to be stone. A soldier knelt, lifted a piece to the light, and dropped it immediately. A bone, a human bone. Then they saw them, stacks of limbs tossed into corners like discarded scraps. Skulls arranged in rows, their hollow eyes staring from the darkness. Flesh peeled from bodies, half rotten, crawling with maggots. The smell was unbearable. Some men gagged, others turned away, murmuring prayers. But there was no salvation here, and in the deepest part of the cave, they found the clan. They did not fight. They did not scream. They only watched, blinking against the torchlight, their pale bodies curled into the corners like insects beneath a lifted stone. They had lived in the dark for too long. The light was agony. Their eyes watered. Their skin twitched. Some cowered. Others clung to each other, their faces twisted in confusion, in fear, in something else. Sawney Bean stood among them, silent, unmoving. He did not kneel. He did not speak. He only stared at the men before him, at the swords drawn, at the fire flickering in their hands. And then he smiled. There was no trial, no questions, no final words, only rage, only vengeance. The men did not hesitate. They dragged the beans from the cave, tearing them from the only home they had ever known. They screamed now, finally, wailing like dying animals as they were bound in chains and hauled into the world above. They were paraded through the villages they had haunted for decades, displayed like beasts from the depths of hell. The people who had whispered of monsters now saw them with their own eyes, pale, sunken, barely human. And then, one by one, they were torn apart. The men were the first to die. The executioners took their time, hands, feet, ears. One piece at a time, they were cut apart, left to bleed in the streets. The women and children were burned alive, their screams echoing through the city square, their flesh turning to ash beneath the flames. Sawney was the last. He did not beg. He did not plead. As they cut him down, piece by piece, the king himself stood watching. And with his final breath, Sawney Bean only smiled. No repentance, no regret. Only the satisfaction of a man who had never obeyed a single rule but his own. And then, there was nothing. The bodies were gone. The cave was empty. The roads were safe once more. But the legend never faded. Travelers still whisper of strange shapes on the cliffs, of footsteps in the night, of shadows moving through the fog. Some say the beans are still out there, that some escaped, that their bloodline still lingers. And even now, centuries later, the people of Scotland know one thing for certain. There are some places you should never go, some caves that should never be entered, some roads that should never be traveled alone, because monsters are not born, they are made. And sometimes, they never truly die.